The new Era Convergence was an audacious undertaking, really. We started out just feeling a compelling need to bring people together, to have some deep conversations that we didn't see being had elsewhere. We came out of nowhere with this, really. It was not something that was in a lineage of another movement. In fact, it stood outside of other movements. It was really a synthetic initiative. I think it took a lot for people to wrap their minds around what it was that we were endeavoring to do. And we ourselves had to give an increasing definition as we went. What it was that defined the New Era Convergence, what should be its primary objectives.
I'm a part of the New Era Convergence that is planning a movement to bring forward groups and organizations that are working towards social transformation and system change, bringing forward a promise for our future, a future that is just, that is equitable, and that is sustainable. And this is not just a one-time event. We are planning on creating a network that holds these groups and these visions together and creates a plan for moving forward.
We talked about how do we articulate thinking in terms of a whole systems change, and not just like single issues or particular points of intervention, but thinking in a larger scale. The second point was how do we actually empower people with the kinds of not just thinking but skills and other tools needed to engage in that kind of work. And a piece of that's like how do we mobilize people, and then a third piece was how do if we think in terms of a movement, how much organization do we need? How do we coordinate amongst all the various different efforts that people are engaged in, so much of which are needed? And is there some kind of way that people can envision that the work they're doing is part of something greater or a larger whole? So I think in broad strokes, thinking beyond our capitalist system and what kind of a system do we want, and hence the name of a new era. And then again, that kind of, if we're going to think in those terms, what is that system going to be? How do we empower people to engage in it, and how do we coordinate that work?
And that we were kind of affirmed when we saw quotes from David Korten and
from Canada. What was her name?
Klein.
Naomi Klein.
Naomi Klein and David Korten at the same time were putting out statements about the need that the pressing issues of the day were to figure out where we wanted to go and how we were going to get there. And those are the big overarching questions that we were also felt were pressing, and that also felt nobody was really addressing those in a kind of comprehensive, holistic way. And we felt that based on our decades of activism and thinking on these questions, that we could provide, convene this conversation.
Clare, you did a lot of the outreach. You took more initiative with that than just about anybody, and particularly we're reaching out to those who are working for greater social and environmental justice. What were some of your key experiences?
Generally, it was people were interested in the concept, and as you said, it was hard to wrap generally hard to wrap our brain around a big picture, because we're very much entrained in the project that we're involved in doing. We are housing the homeless. We are doing, taking down carbon. We're working with the city government to implement better policies. And so it's really challenging to say yes, 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 and how do we weave those together so that we have a more synergetic impact? In fact, it was mostly people who weren't really focused on specific projects and involved in specific organizations that came forward and participated.
Yeah. Jason, as I remember, you, in some of your research, were coming across people's reflections that a broad movement toward progressive change was kind of at an impasse. That people were seeing that there are huge systemic problems in the society. People were getting mobilized around particular issues, but not making progress that was commensurate with the intensity of what we were facing.
I think a prevailing conversation amongst those who want a different world is precisely the question of well, how do we do that? And I think people have different terms or concepts for what kind of a world we want. I don't know that those are always overly substantive or much detail. And some people even say we shouldn't think too much detail because it has to be something that we make along the way. There's a number of discussions like this, but the prevailing feeling was what is the approach or strategic direction that we need to take. And we see this in the climate movement, we see this in other movements as well, that there's not making headway. And so for some people then the question is, well, what should we be doing? How should we be going about it? And I think part of what like David Korten, Naomi Klein, and others are calling for, and Korten specifically used the language of having a discussion to answer these questions, because I don't think anyone has a ready-made answer for it. And so part of our goal at the New Era Convergence was to bring people together to begin, as Clare said, thinking about and beginning to articulate that overarching question, so that this kind of impasse, that we can begin to move through it and move away from, yes, and I've made emphasis that there has to be a consistent need to try to ameliorate the harms at so many different places where hurt, damage is happening in communities, in landscapes, in people's lives, and so forth. But at
the same time,
we have to be able to construct something that's different. And so how to do that, I think, is the big question that people were at an impasse for in terms of what to do.
So, Ravi, when we were talking about building the program, you came up with this idea of a narrative arc about how do we have this discussion, starting from where people are at, which is not thinking about it at all, to trying to get some shared vision and next steps that we could move together toward. Do you want to explain that arc?
Yeah, well, there was a point at which I sat down and kind of tried to hold in my mind all of the conversations we were having. And they were conversations about what is it that's coming at us in the future if things continue the way they are in the world, with not a lot there to really be stopping them. What are the different pathways that people are taking to bring change, and what are their comparative pros and cons? What is our assessment of what we've done in the past? What have we learned? How is it that we're going to need to prepare ourselves to be on some sort of solid foundations as things get more intense in the world, as we anticipate they will? What is it that holds us together? There's a diversity of silos that we're functioning out of, and there's some with grander arcs to their thinking. There is this kind of metaphorical image of the Blessed Unrest movement, of there being a large and very diverse but amorphous movement of people wanting to bring change on the basis of some sort of a new worldview, a more Gaian worldview. But what is it that really holds that together? And then, as Jason has been stressing, and you also have mentioned, Clare, what is what are the steps we need to take? What are the things we need to start putting together to make progress? So when I said, so all these big ideas, big questions, big concerns had been arising out of our conversations, and when I sat with them, I saw, yeah, there is a natural arc from starting from a realization of just the depth of the threat that humanity is now facing due to the greed of capitalism in the main. There are perhaps other causes, but that is the primary one. Going from there to what are we doing? What are the lessons we've learned? How do we need to situate ourselves for the times we're facing into, or headed into? What are the pieces we need to put together? What are the next steps? And then hopefully coming out of our convergence with some idea of next steps that can give us momentum to go into where we need to be headed.
You might want to look up more. You're looking at the ground.
Okay.
Yeah. So I found it interesting that there was a diversity of perspectives on the urgency and what we were facing. Do you want to? Are there any?
Well, that was our first program. In
Right.
fact, we knew that there would be a diversity, so we characterized that first program as one of taking the temperature, collective temperature, as a metaphor for what is the range of viewpoints as to where we stand, and I guess one thing I took away from that is. We live in a world in which we're dealing with our lives in our immediate situations. There's a lot of news, a lot of information coming at us, and there's not been a lot of deep collective reflection on where we stand. So it was there was different degrees to which people were informed. And we kind of went through, but as we went through, just looking at one arena after another of the society, people were bringing forward their awarenesses and started to paint a picture. What we're looking at in terms of climate change, environmental degradation, what we're looking at in terms of the political landscape just increasingly moving into illiberalism and dysfunction, what we're looking at in terms of the social arena, just greater and greater alienation and antagonism between competing tribes, how we're situated economically, the concerns that people are having as to how fragile the economy seems and where that might be headed. So you build that all together, and we started to create some ground that, yeah, this is now momentous, and we have to have a response that is commensurate with the intensity of the moment. We have to rise to the occasion. I think it was after that program that your program came, Jason, in which you took us through conversations related to the different approaches that were the different kinds of responses that people have been making to our situation. Maybe you'd want to talk a little about that.
Sure. So the idea was how do you imagine like some kind of pathway to change? So do we put our efforts into formal political platforms and getting people out to vote and trying to change policy in that way? Do we focus more on creating, say, like alternative models that demonstrate other ways of doing things, and so forth? I could go through, there were some, dozen of these, and the idea was to kind of think through well, okay, what are the pluses and minuses? What are their strengths and weaknesses? When are these types of approaches appropriate in what ways, and when are they not? So I think and then the outcome of that was a discussion in which people had a recognition that there's in fact a diversity of ways in which we have to go about this work. There's no single approach that's just going to solve the problems. And so we need to have diverse fronts of action. And then in addition to that was the realization that, okay, to what extent do we formalize that and the kind of challenges of coordinating that? So for example, how do you balance some kind of an organization that can hold that picture together with all the different other organizations doing some of the more specific work? How do those relationships work? And then especially in the context of, and this was something else that emerged, was the issue of resources. How do we resource these different pathways without getting into like a lot of competition with each other, but also recognize that there's a need for resources across multiple fronts. So this kind of a conversation, I think, came about. And then also thinking about the relationship between different levels and scales of action. As you mentioned, Ravi, some folks are very focused more individually in their lives about making change, maybe at their neighborhood level. Other folks are thinking larger scale or in terms of policy. So how to balance all of those, I think, was a core kind of outcome. So we didn't come up with like the solution, but it was more about recognition of I think you mentioned what's the commensurate response. Well, we had a recognition, at least in part, of the kind of wide-scale challenge that we face trying to organize something that's not on the kind of model that we've had in the past, because it can't be, given the nature of the problem and its complexity. So I think that was a bit where we were at. So, and then flowing from that became, okay, what can we actually learn from those moments in the past and some of those in more specific efforts.
That was Clare's program.
And that was Clare's program. Yeah.
So, as I mentioned, many of us have a lot of experience doing this work in the past, and very rarely do activists sit down and evaluate how has this moved us forward? Really, what is it, and what can we take forward, and what didn't work? What mistakes do we not want to have again? So we had a panel of someone who's been involved in the climate change movement. I talked about the feminist movement, second wave feminist movement. We had someone who's a housing activist and someone who's involved in eco-villages and permaculture. And so all of these are very creative, generative points of activism. And so some of the things that came out of that discussion, and we each talked a little bit about what that particular movement involved, and then we invited the audience, the participants, to analyze that in terms of what are cross-cutting lessons. So I think there's a tension between the focus and the localism with larger scope is one of the things. The other thing that came out was what Jason was just referencing, is having the resources. And that is also relative to the political climate that you're in. That in an era where everything is being privatized with neoliberalism in the Reagan era, for instance, then money, there's not easily available. Right now, it's really hard for youth to be politically active like my generation was, because it's so hard to get by, So how do we resource something is a big question. Another piece was, how do we bridge divides? So there's the urban-rural divide, there's the generational divide. There's one of the contributions from the feminist movement was that it was a very white, middle-class led movement initially. And it was evolved from the leadership of black women to become what we call intersectional, to look at the relationship between different populations. So
there was also a couple people brought up the limitation from that they'd experienced from having a narrow focus, and how they felt it would impact. For example, from the permaculturists cannot really build out a permaculture society unless they're addressing issues of political power also.
right.
They can't just build solutions. They also have to mobilize the grassroots power to give an impetus for change at a policy level.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point in terms of being solutions oriented rather than fighting, what the damage has been. To reshift our focus to where do we want to go, what is the solution, what steps can we take now. And even the climate change movement was more focused on solutions now, I think, but it's still how do we draw down, how do we ameliorate the damage, rather than how do we transform the economic basis for the current situation.
Yeah, I remember David Haken. He's quite a great man, very dedicated to the climate change movement, talking about how he's developed a keen interest in permaculture because he feels that need for practical solutions
Right.
to complement the political activism.
On the other hand, permaculture, having a backyard or a front yard garden or a sweet little farm somewhere and hiding out isn't going to make the kind of systemic change
Exactly.
that we need to do. So, there's a lot of individual or small community solutions that don't add up to changing capitalism and the underlying economic issues.
Yeah. I think that led into a program I facilitated in which we started to collectively look at, as the climate crises intensify, as economic collapse is upon us, the political situation deepens. How do we need to situate ourselves? How do we need to prepare for that? There were several arenas that we thought were particularly important. We're going to have an infrastructure that operates. We see in some of these recent climate disasters just how quickly critical infrastructure gets taken down. We need not only to have it, but to rebuild it in a way that is sustainable. In fact, that's an opportunity to actually advance toward the society we want. Another arena is the provision of basic necessities. Already we're seeing that availability of housing is such a crisis for so many. There's a lot of indications that availability of food is a growing problem in the world. And medical care may also be a problem. So these basic necessities of life, we're going to have to be able to provide those in need, and also understanding that maybe more and more are going to be in need as crises deepen. And one other arena we looked at a little bit was what happens if currency becomes so inflated that it significantly loses its value, or currency doesn't become as viable. Do we need other mediums of exchange? How do we get capital to establish the kind of new economic institutions that we want to see as a part of the new society? So there's an economic dimension. And then I think people also gave some attention to what are going to be our potential security needs if the kind of divisive rhetoric intensifies in our society, where we have these tribes that enter into some sort of deepening conflict. So there's big things like that we feel we need to be thinking through to survive, and also to be able to have some foundation from which, some standing from which we can move forward, building the new society and challenging the injustices of the old.
Well, essentially, we've talked about the shock doctrine that Naomi Klein talks about, where things collapse and the neo-imperialist system moves in and privatizes everything for the profit of the corporate world and basically takes over whole countries that way. And why aren't we able to move into a situation where an entire town is burnt down and develop a permaculture community that's off the grid and energy free? So we got to start thinking in those bigger ways, I think.
Right. Instead of the neoliberal institutions taking over, it will be the New Era movement institutions taking over. That's what we're envisioning. Where did we go from there? Jason, I think your program.
Well, a question was, how do you actually build unity and solidarity? And I mean, one of the things that I think a basic recognition is that in a capitalist society, even though you have competing capitalist interests, trying to get their market share, get their brand out, and so on, they all agree on the basic fundamental premise of turning all the work that they do into profit making. If the motive of profit is not going to be the unifying feature for the kind of dominant activities that order and rule and organize our lives, then how do you then build unity and solidarity? In particular, when you have some of the issues that we've brought up, which is you have people working on different fronts for different things, with different goals in mind, with different approaches. How to bring all that together is a huge question. And so we considered that in terms of 4 areas. One was, what is it that is common that all people need and aspire to? So whether that's basic necessities, food and shelter and clean water and so on, healthcare, you name it, to a certain kind of opportunity to be able to find meaning in life and develop one's mental or spiritual capacity. So what is it that actually can unify people? So that question was on the table. Another question, and then how do you go about communicating that and articulating that in a way that makes sense to people when there's so many other things that they're thinking of that divide them? A second key question was, how do you coordinate amongst these different fronts, because there is a need to work on different fronts and to be in different areas, whether it's helping people develop a local food system, helping meet the needs for housing and so on. How do you coordinate amongst those different fronts? Is there some kind of shared ideology or shared sense of identity that people working in that work, or a shared sense of values, and so forth? And then how do you create systems where people can not only communicate but share resources and also learn and evaluate their work and so forth? And a third area was, how do you mobilize connections amongst different groups and different individuals, different areas of work that can be existing or work that we create? But how do you actually mobilize those connections? And so in particular at the Convergence, there were some people who couldn't be there for a variety of reasons, or there's some people that we think should have been there, but how do you reach out and make that connection? So thinking in those terms. And then the fourth area was this conundrum and issue that Clare brought up, which is the actual social divides that people have, whether they're real or perceived, but how do you bridge some of these divides across a variety of different, whether it's certain competing ways in which people identify themselves, or it's because they have just vastly different experiences. And really these 4 areas, we had groups that were considering these things, and they're all a piece of this single puzzle of how do you build unity and solidarity. And I think that I would characterize the conversations that we had as just kind of initially getting a sense of the problem and putting out a few ideas. We did not generate, okay, here's the plan, right, or anything of that nature. But before you can even do that, you got to get a sense of the lay of the land. What is the actual nature of the problem? And I think we began to get some of those pieces and have that conversation, and the recognition that this question of unity and solidarity takes a lot of work, and there's a lot that we need to do to bring that forward.
That did take us to some final discussions about what should be our next steps. I think that was a program you facilitated in the main.
Well, Brad did that.
Brad started it,
Yeah.
and then you
Right.
you had a follow-up in which you concretized some of that.
So people did a lot of small group exploration about solutions, different types of solutions in different sectors. Like there were a lot of mental health care workers there, so they talked about that, and the idea in my mind that it came out of in terms of next steps is that there are a lot of I'm being calling them nodules. I don't know if that's the right word. Foci points for action that people are already engaged in. For instance, the permaculture convergence that's happening, the imagining different housing solutions, the efforts of the mental health community to meet the needs that are coming out of the communities, and there are different topics, and then there's also different geographies, right? So next steps, I think it has to be distributed. We're not going to have a strong centralized Communist Party movement or anything like that. That's kind of last century. So it's got to be distributed, and then as Jason was pointing out, it's got to be networked. We have to have ways to communicate with each other. We have to have ways to support each other, to institutionalized ways to manage our resources and our money and to get more money. We have to have ways to train and develop the skill sets and capacities of people on the ground. And so these are part of the infrastructure of a broader New Era movement that next steps are to start to building those out. What I was just looking at the notes, somebody was discussing having hubs of action, like a hub that is involved in a activist, highly socially dense network community, like we're trying to build here in this neighborhood, combined with permaculture, and so that's a hub of practice, a hub of activism. But also, and there can be lots of hubs like that of different varieties, but then also have a virtual network that where people can go, and there's links to different education programs. Some of the people who came to the Convergence are doing, Pachamama has a whole education training program. Ananda Marga, what is it? Transformation Education has a program. There's one that comes called Democracy School. So there's a lot of education programs that we can coordinate and build accessibility to on a broader level online, and that could also partner with on-the-ground practice and for movement building. So those are some ideas of next steps. The other thing that was important, I think, is that there's several layers of action. One is dealing with immediate response to crisis, like a town burns down and people need a place to go. But then the solutions from that should point towards the new system. So then we want to have transitional housing communities, which we're experimenting with here in Eugene, and some of the people were doing that were there. And in those communities, people are trying different alternative technologies, are learning different skills, and then they have the ability to go out and build new era communities. So, period.
I think a key, this didn't come up, it came up somewhat at the New Era Convergence, but it's a thing that's been on my mind a lot, is, and so many people are very action, like we need to, and there were people there like, why aren't we out like doing action? Why are we having the discussion and so on? And I like to remind people that actually thinking and discussing is a form of action. If you don't have a sense of what it is you're doing and you're just doing it, then it's a kind of directionless or aimless kind of thing. And so the point I'm making is that I think there's a real need to be thinking in terms of how do we shift the narrative and the sense of imagination that people have when they think about the world and the kind of change they're trying to make in the world. So instead of slogans like, we're fighting the power, we're like building the new era. Or instead of thinking in terms of, we've got unhomed people on the streets, everything's more or less fine, we just need to get them into some shelter. Well, why aren't we thinking about that we want to just cut all that out? I was trying to give an example.
Why are we putting Band-Aids on the problems rather than changing the underlying cause of the
There
problem?
we go. And then, or...
Why are we putting Band-Aids of the problem, like building fancy huts for homeless people to live in, rather than looking at the causes of the problem, which is the economics of housing?
And then Claire made a good point about, like, when we actually say are building housing, why aren't we building it in new and different ways that help people? So it's not just getting a roof over their heads, but it has these other forms of technology, because the aim is to set up, say, forms of work or forms of productivity where people can make contributions in the community, and it's not just get a roof over your head and then plug into what's going on, because we're going to keep doing what the status quo
Plug
is.
into exploited labor.
But the point is, like, how do we shift how we even understand what it is we're trying to do, and to have a sense of that narrative, and to move it away from, the current narrative is still talking about, red states and blue states and liberals and conservatives and so on, and we're in a situation of massive multiple crises on the planet, and we have to kind of shift how we think about what it is we're trying to do as we navigate that. So the point is, I don't have a big, I'm trying to rethink what the narrative of how we understand what it is we're doing, and the more that we can give concrete form to that, the more direction and purpose it infuses into the action that we know we need to take.
People are operating more out of their vision for the future rather than just their reaction to the oppression that they feel in the present.
I like what Naomi Klein said: if you don't know where you're going, what you're leaping towards, you're just jumping up and down. And I think we made some strides at the New Era Convergence towards collectively imagining what we're leaping towards.
Now, in addition to the programs that were a part of the this broad conversational arc, there were some auxiliary programs too that added significantly to the feel, the connectivity of the convergence. Do either of you want to talk about them?
We can just play the videos of them. Which ones are you thinking of?
Well, there was the workshops. There was the open space conversations. There was the cultural dimension.
We've been blanking out on what those were.
There was music. There was quality. Everyone raved about the quality of the food and the both the simplicity but the substance of that food. There was a collective grief ritual that was very moving and transformative for a number of people who had not ever participated in having the opportunity to just give physical expression to the grief that they have, and to do it in a supportive space. And I think that all of these different pieces, there was ecstatic dance, the opportunity to move, to get outside, to be physical, and I think the ways in which all these things worked together created a certain synergy that was more than just coming in and having this intellectual kind of discussion, but it created a whole body experience for people over the course of 2.5 days.
It bound us in community.
Yeah, community.
And there was also a poem.
Ah, yes.
A poem that was written, inspired by the convergence itself.
Did you get that on video, Heather reading her poem? No? Okay.
Oh, I thought that would be the perfect background comment to the poem.
As long as we're just talking, so you can mention the swimming. It was good.
The environment was next to a reservoir where a lot of people enjoyed swimming. There was a big open space. There were trees. There were
trails
and swallows and frisbee, and so I think the idea was that we wanted a whole person experience because that's what the kind of future that we want.
Yeah. And then one other program slot that you championed as much as anyone was the open space conversations.
Right. So some conferences, new era facilitation suggests that don't fill up the whole agenda with preset ideas of what to do. Invite people to convene discussions around something that they want more depth in. So we did have space for that.
One thing our videographer noted was that these were not lectures, classes, presentations that people attended. That by and large, this was collective work we did through conversation, small group breakouts. Jason, you brought a lot of awareness to bear from your background as a university instructor. Do you want to talk at all about the methodology of engagement that got woven into the conference?
Well, I think a primary thing was just creating opportunities for people to think, to converse, and to give expression to ideas, and then to collectively consider those, and then what are different ways in which we can capture the voices in the room. Not everyone feels comfortable speaking aloud in front of a large group and so on. So, I have in my office after the convergence all these pieces of paper. There's sticky notes, there's things written. We've transcribed a number of these, but it's a way in which we are gleaning the, I'll call it the collective wisdom from the specific ideas and insights that people had. And so how do we organize in a way to get as much of that as we can? And from that, then learn where people are at, where people are wanting to go, and then this question that animated, I think, the whole thing is how do we do it? But I think we have to think about that not just in the abstract, but how do we actually come together and learn together and be together in a way that does that too. So part of the methodology was to make it highly interactive and generative, based on people's experiences as well as what they imagine is needed, and then the kind of cross discussion and then what would emerge from that. And I think we did a fairly effective job of doing that. There's always more that could be done.
One of the other next steps and outcomes was an emphasis on relationships and relationship building. It was observed that there was a pretty overwhelming presence of middle-aged white people, and that we don't need to be apologetic about that. That's the community that we are coming from. Those are the relationships we had to build on, but what that points to is that we have to acknowledge that that's the that there's a chunk of perspectives that are missing from our overview, from our collective wisdom, and that the task is to do that relationship building going forward so that our wisdom is more whole, multi-perspectived.
Yeah, speaking of relationship building, as I remember, Jason, you felt that should be the first priority of our coming together. The building, the beginning of weaving relationships and trust. Yeah. And you set up an opening process to facilitate that. Do you want to speak to?
Well, the opening process essentially, the idea is that you welcome people, you have a sense of agreements for how we want to interact and participate, and then you create an opportunity in smaller groups where people can share what are they concerned about, what are the kind of things that they're engaged in their community or something important, and what is the kind of thing that they want to be a part of, like questions of this nature, just as a way to ease into getting to know other people, as well as beginning to think and imagine and give expression to where one's at, and and from that kind of a foundation, moving forward into some of these more facilitated or deeper conversations that we had. So that was, in a sense, the kind of intention behind that. I think that it did create an opportunity for people to begin building those relationships, and then of course people found all kinds of ways to do that throughout the program in a variety of settings.
What was your memory of the closing circle when we went around and evaluated? People individually gave their evaluation, or their when they expressed what there was about the program that had meaning to them.
I have to look at my notes.
Huh?
I don't really want to answer that right now. We can show the video of that. Do we have video of that? The final circle where people are saying what they're taking away?
I left before dinner.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. Then we don't have to have anything about that. All right.
Yeah.
Well, that was a real upbeat moment.
Hey, that very final piece was more people giving expression. The prompt was around, what is it that we're grateful for? So giving expressions of gratitude. And so that was naming individuals for particular contributions like their music or their food, naming particular programs as highlights and why those were moving experiences or particularly insightful, giving gratitude for the site itself, the care that goes into maintaining that and stewarding that and creating a space where people can come together and do what we did. So it was really about speaking at that level, but that also reinforces the deeper point about we always have to be paying attention to the work we're doing and identifying the things that we are grateful for. And then, we had a number of tools, after people left and went home, was following up and asking questions. What was your experience like? What could we improve next time? How do we make these kinds of shifts? But that evaluative, or I don't want to call it evaluative, it's more of an assessment of how it went and paying attention to our learning experience together. Like,
and
that
what
was
we took
built
away
in,
also.
and what we took away. That was an important piece that we built into it.
Yeah. Clare and I attended another group that was a whole systems
Whole
group.
systems group.
Hey, an interesting point is that when we talked about the changes in the future we want, there was scope for a broad span of contributions from people who were talking big ideas about the systems change that is needed, to people who are engaged in very concrete work to actualize the values of this new system that's being envisioned. So there was appreciation of the need for big vision and for concrete implementation, for thinking through where we need to go, but also to have our feet in the soil, in the dirt, of being able to, dig the ground for that new society that we want to grow.
I think a lot of the next steps have to do with movement building and building the infrastructure to support that movement.
Yeah.
Like I mentioned before, the simple enough to have a website with a splash page that directs people to different learning opportunities. To start mapping, we call it asset mapping. What are people doing that's relevant to this issue? Not only here, but in our bioregion, but nationally. We have a project, an asset mapping project already started, looking at, that's on period.
I mentioned earlier, some people think that having discussions is an action, but if you don't have discussions with people that you know, or your neighbors, or the people in your community, how will you ever convince anyone what it is that you're doing, or what they can do, or how they can contribute? And so I mentioned about, what's the narrative? How are you going to have that conversation with people? And as I understand it historically and in my research, the work of organizing really comes down to being able to have a conversation with someone and convince them towards whatever it is that you're working for. And that's the kind of organizing work that we've got to do now. And then having these pieces like Clare mentioned to point people so they can take it deeper or go farther. But we've really got to come to the place now where we're organizing and having conversations about the world we want and how people can plug into that work. And that's where I think we're at.
We need the conversations to convince people to move towards solutions, but then we need to inspire them to engage.
And I think there's also the sense that it's critical that we get out of our comfort zones. That we got to talk to people we haven't talked to before. We have to learn how to have different language. We have to try things that we haven't tried before and push ourselves to take it to a new era, because otherwise we're stuck in the same old place.